the Honorable Speaker of Parliament, Honorable Tandy Modise, honored and distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, all protocol observed. Thank you very much for your attendance at this important event, the Indlulamithi Day. I'd like just to take note of some housekeeping rules so that we can make this web seminar as smooth as possible. All cameras must be switched off. For all questions, please type in the chat bar on the bottom right of your screens. Also take note that we will not be ignoring if you raise your hands. It's just that we will have a Q&A session later on where we'll answer all your questions. We might not be able to get through all your questions, but we'll try as much as possible to address all the key themes. We met in June 2018 to launch the Indlulamithi Scenarios project at the theatre on the track in Kyalami in Midrand. On that day, we were honored by the President of the Republic of South Africa, President Cyril Ramaphosa, who graced the event by his attendance and delivered the keynote address. One of the key questions that the President posed to us on that day was whether there was a scenario that was far scarier than the three scenarios that we are unveiling and presenting. He challenged us to stretch our imagination even further. It is amazing how prophetic that question or challenge was, looking at where we are today. A year later, in June 2019, we were honored by the attendance of the Chief Justice of South Africa, Chief Justice Mogoeng, who delivered a keynote address on the anniversary of the launch of the Indlulamithi Scenarios at the Convention Center in Sandton, which is now known as Indlulamithi Day. This year, we have the pleasure and the honor to have amongst us the Speaker of the National Assembly of South Africa, Honorable Tandy Modise, who would deliver the keynote address today. Indlulamithi is a Nguni word for giraffe. A giraffe is a tall animal. It stands heads and shoulders above the rest of the animal kingdom. This is emblematic of the uniqueness of the individual contributions and the value that each of the participants bring to the Indlulamithi initiative. The work of imagining and building unique future while looking at the prism of the current reality. Indlulamithi Scenarios project is an initiative that seeks to build, inculcate, or embed long-term strategic thinking into society on the future of South Africa. Through Indlulamithi Scenarios, we seek to realize a common purpose, a shared vision by focusing on the recognition of our diversity and solidarity as a means to development and progress. The Indlulamithi Scenarios are predicated or anchored on answering the key question, which is to say, what would a socially cohesive South Africa look like? And to what degree is it attainable by the year 2030? This project is about the possible futures for South Africa. The world has changed very significantly since we launched the Indlulamithi Scenarios. A number of seismic events have taken place. South Africa's sovereign rating was downgraded by Moody's to junk in March 2020, moving the ratings down to BA1 from Baa3. Standard & Poor's lowered South Africa's sovereign rating further into non-investment grade or junk. And this was also followed by Fitch downgrading of 5 of South Africa's largest banks deeper into junk, and they cited the deteriorating operating environment following the outbreak of the COVID-19, which has fundamentally altered the landscape. The way we worship, the way we work, the way we consume entertainment, the way we partake in sport, the way we conduct meetings, the way we bid farewell to our loved ones, the way we conduct social activities, the way in which we impart and deliver knowledge and comprehension of the world as we know has changed dramatically. So as we meet today, no one would have imagined a year ago that Indulamithi Day anniversary will be celebrated through a virtual platform. But here we are. I want to welcome you and thank you for your attendance virtually, to be part of looking above the trees and take part in the shaping of the South Africa that we all want. I will now hand over to Ms. Tumi Morake of the Giraffe Neck News to give us the day's headlines.
Hello and welcome. My name is Tumi Morake and this is Giraffe Neck News 2020 edition, brought to you by Indlulamithi Scenarios. Indlulamithi's goal is to find answers to the big question facing our country. How do we achieve a socially cohesive South Africa by 2030? So, as the name suggests, we asked some of South Africa's best and brightest to stick their necks out and tell us what they see happening in the country between now and 2030. Yeah, I know, uncertain stuff. Who knows anything, right? But I reckon we could all use a bit of long-term thinking right about now, just to put things into perspective. A smart man once said, scenarios aren't about predicting the future. It's about deciding what to do now. So let's open our ears, our hearts, our minds, and just somehow open everything, man. Like put Vicks, Vaporub all over. And then just take a look at where we've been, at where we're going, and what can we do now. Just to be clear, Indlulamithi Scenarios doesn't claim to have a crystal ball or any special powers of prophecy. It's not like they hire Sangoma to throw the bones. I see social cohesion and reduced inequality. Vulnerable. No. These guys have done their research. Scenario planning, it's a whole thing, apparently. Lots of countries do it, and we've used scenarios before in South Africa, to make big decisions like in the early 90s. So, in these uncertain times, long-term scenario planning is more relevant than ever. It's all about making informed choices, not just reacting to what's going on out there, like, yo, there's a virus. Hey, there's load shedding. And that's why back in 2017, we spoke to people from all walks of life to develop 3 stories of how the future of South Africa could look. Gwara Gwara is a scenario where we become a demoralized land filled with disorder and decay. So what's that now? Much worse, let's not even go there. Ispushwa is where South Africa is torn by deepening social divides, daily protests, and cynical self-interest. In other words, this messed up, unjust situation right now. Question is, how much longer do we want to hang out in this scenario? And Nai Lewak is a scenario where South Africa enjoys growing social cohesion, economic expansion, and a renewed pride in our constitution. Yes, please. Yes, I'll take that one in every color. Thank you. So, these stories were put together in 2017, but what's been happening since then? Well, every year, Indlulamithi tracks a bunch of indicators published by reputable organizations to see which scenario the country is moving into. They also conduct a perception survey with over 900 ordinary South Africans to get their input. because our feelings and our choices matter most. Then they put it all together to create a barometer of how things are going in South Africa. This year, there's one for the country and one for each province. And they do some fancy economic modeling that looks at what different policies will do for our economy in the future. Just look at that, huh? That's some higher grade math right there. Oh, and one more thing before we get started. I know we're all about giraffes, but let's take a moment to acknowledge the very, very small elephant in the room. Yeah, you know that one. You see, we were all ready with our 2020 report at the end of February, and then coronavirus, COVID-19, Miss Rona, Coco, whatever you want to call it, just came out and then just. I mean, this virus, it's all like everything just, I'm actually unable to We'll talk later. The thing to remember is that all the issues facing our country before the pandemic are still there, ticking away like a time bomb. You know, like the poverty, the hunger, the unemployment, credit downgrades, all that bad stuff. We may have forgotten them for a while. I mean, we've had other things on our minds, like surviving lockdown and dealing with corona here. But none of the challenges facing South Africa pre-pandemic have gone away. The virus just added a new crisis on top of the old ones, like an overloaded taxi, making everything worse. So, to cover everything properly, like the professional journalists we are, we've included headlines from before COVID and now. We've also included this helpful little meter down here that shows us whether we're moving in the right direction, the wrong direction, or a bit of both. Right, everyone got that? Y'all ready for this? Strap on your seatbelts, it could get bumpy.
On behalf of the entire Indlulamithi team and Indlulamithi family, I would like to thank everyone joining us here today, be they joining us from home, virtually, or watching television, or following us in any other platform. Today marks our third annual Indlulamithi Day. It is indeed a historic Indlulamithi Day, one that we will always remember, as the COVID-19 crisis forces us to meet virtually. We thank you for your time and hope you are all safe and well in your various places. The overall impact of the Indlulamithi South Africa Scenarios 2030 can be understood in terms of what we set out to achieve. The utilization of the input we received from a range of stakeholders across the country, as well as the influence we've had on public discourse, the development planning of various institutions, as well as public policy making, the sustained relevance of this project since its first launch, and continuous tracking of unfolding scenarios, as well as the adoption of tools by policymakers, is a testimony to its impact, which has further been heightened by the current global COVID-19 pandemic. You'll recall that in the past, most scenario projects were only known when they were launched, but we've tried to make sure that we sustain it by tracking the trends. It is not COVID-19 that makes today historic, but two other moments. First, Indlulamithi National Barometer will today provide us with the very first year-on-year trend reading, following its launch last year. Second, we also will be introducing 9 provincial barometers, which is the first that we're doing here. These tools will, for the first time, show us how the scenarios are unfolding across each province, painting a more nuanced picture of the state of the nation. Both are exciting developments in Indlulamithi work, which was first conceptualized in 2017, it has been 3 years since we set out to establish a platform for strategic conversation about South Africa's current trajectory and possible future scenarios. It has been 3 years since we set out to answer the main question: what does a socially cohesive South Africa look like, and to what degree is it attainable by 2030? It has been 2 years since the President, as my colleague has already said, came to launch the first results and the first scenarios. And we do have 3 scenarios here in essence. The first one is Gwara Gwara, which is a worst-case scenario, which imagines South Africa as a demoralized land of disorder and decay. And the second one is Isi Bourgeois, imagining an enclave bourgeoisie nation where sharp class divisions define the character of the country. And the third one is Naila Walk, envisioning a nation in step with itself, with more coordinated efforts to resolve challenges and develop the country. And it has been 1 year since we launched the National Indlulamithi Barometer and economic modeling. Both tools help us track which of the 3 scenarios is becoming more prominent in our country, measuring the consequences of today's decisions on our collective future. As we journey in the evolution of Indlulamithi program, we have, in the selection of our speakers, managed to get the head of the executive, the president, and the following year we were able to get the head of the judiciary, the chief justice. And today we are so honored to have the head of the legislature, the Honorable Speaker Tandy Modise. And that in itself is symbolic to say our work affects all spheres of government, all branches of government, private sector, civil society. That is why we have a range of all different role players. Over the last 3 years, our work has helped to improve planning capacity, enrich public policy discussion, and inform long-term strategic thinking in South Africa. Our work has fed into debates on economic, national, regional, and institutional strategies. It has featured in social compacting summits nationally, the 2019 Institute of Risk Management South Africa Risk Report, it featured there prominently, and the growing Gauteng Together 2030 strategy document or report by Gauteng Provincial Government also anchored its work, taking a lot from this particular exercise. Many other departments and institutions have come for partnership or to learn how they could vision tunnel their own companies or organizations. I've been humbled listening to many voices reflecting on the importance and timely relevance of scenario work. One such voice is my colleague who is going to be speaking later, Dr. Padili Hotla, former Statistician General of South Africa, who says Indlulamithi is bringing clarity and productivity to so many discussions, where previous tools have sometimes been alien to those responsible for planning. The Indlulamithi model is bringing understanding and inspiring more collective decision-making. One former minister remarked that they had not appreciated the scenario work in the past, but with the help of hindsight, she then realized how important it had become to take note of those. Most recently, the COVID-19 crisis, it has been interesting to see how many people are more emphasizing what the future holds. And probably the last pronouncement recently on our electoral reforms further reinforces that. The ultimate goal of our work has always been to use scenarios to inspire a new era of social compacting, We want South Africans from all walks of life to be Indlulamithi people. With this mindset, we will be better prepared for future crises, and many will be asking the current Black Swan event, COVID-19 pandemic, what does it mean for our work? Going forward, we'll factor it in, and it also presents an opportunity for us to do things differently. With this in mind, I would like to hand over to my colleague, Tara, who is going to present the results and the trend reading from this year, from last year. Thank you.
So it's my pleasure to present the second iteration of the Indlulamithi National Barometer. So annually track the extent to which South Africa is moving between the three Indlulamithi scenarios. Now, scenarios are powerful tools for influencing decision-making because they combine storytelling and hard facts. The storytelling links with our emotions and allows us to feel what it would be like to live in one of the scenarios, either the ones we hope for or the ones we hope to avoid. And the hard facts, they ensure that we keep our stories realistic, that we have a shared basis for conversation across different parts of our society, and that we can regularly check our biases and assumptions against something concrete. So now, especially in a crisis, when everything seems to be changing even faster and more fundamentally than usual, we need ways of anchoring our reactions to some longer-term perspective. So when tracking our progress against the scenarios, we need to maintain both the power of the storytelling and the factual basis. So our annual Indlulamithi tracking process has two components. One based on stories and perceptions about key events of the year, and one based on clearly defined empirical indicators. Both are equally valid. They just tell us about our experiences as a country in different ways. So let us start with a review of some of the key events of the year and what that tells us about where we are in terms of the scenarios. So I'm going to hand it back to Tumi Morake.
Pre-corona, we were already facing some pretty serious challenges. Take Eskom, the drunk uncle of state-owned enterprises. Yeah, Eskom. Like if the eye roll emoji and the facepalm emoji had a baby? Yeah. And they kind of deserve the hate, you know? Unplanned power outages, lack of maintenance, severe mismanagement, spiraling debt, deep-rooted corruption, and wet coal. Because apparently Eskom's never heard of an umbrella. Then, just when we thought it was over, widespread load shedding that spiked at stage 6. A level so bad we didn't even know it existed. Speaking of state-owned enterprises, if Eskom is the unreliable uncle, SAA is the fancy auntie with too much makeup who keeps asking for mine. For years now, government spent billions, to keep our national airline afloat. Or is it a flight? Do airlines float? Anyway, SAA was a bottomless pit paralyzed by a management crisis that gave out more golden handshakes than King Midas himself. At least now, a certain SAA big shot has been declared a delinquent director, which actually sounds cool, but it isn't. It really isn't. Another big challenge is the land policy. Now, this is a very emotional and complex topic, so I'm not going to try and make fun because the jokes won't land. Land. The thing is, there's been no substantial movement on this issue for months now, or at least we haven't heard about it in the papers. But unless we find a constructive resolution that accommodates most, if not all stakeholders, that reconstruction post-COVID is going to be built on very shaky ground. But COVID-19 hasn't been all bad, eh? For starters, President Ramaphosa has been really, really presidential lately, and we're loving it. Around 75% of South Africans have expressed trust in his handling of the pandemic, and yeah, when he stood up there at the beginning of the lockdown looking large and in charge, fellow South Africans, everyone was saying, that's my president. Even the white people. Hey, it felt good to be united like that. Unfortunately, a lot of this goodwill was wasted when the government went ahead with some pretty odd restrictions that had zero effect other than to get people angry. Never mind the bans on alcohol, tobacco, and exercise. The one that did it for me was no flip-flops and t-shirts because it's winter. I'm from Bloemfontein. Shorts are a thing in winter. Meneer wears 2 pairs of shorts in winter. Come on, man. You're the Minister of Trade and Industry, not the fashion police. All in all, we're seeing that COVID impacts the rich differently from the poor, the formally employed differently from the informal worker. So everyone's talking about social distancing, but you try keep your distance when you're living in a room with 4 other people, ekasi. To their credit economy, get it? Yeah, no? Okay. Many corporates and wealthy individuals haven't just waited for government. They've given generously to the specially created Solidarity Fund. And that's sincerely wonderful. To be fair, such a big donation shows real commitment to South Africa. It shows a bit of structural inequality too, but let's focus on the commitment. Ne? Let's start with the good news. The world is loving us right now, and not just because of old favorites like Trevor and Charlize. No, we won the Rugby World Cup, remember? No, man, not in 95, just a few months ago. Yeah, that one, we'd see ya. We love you, see ya. Also, Netflix is producing amazing local shows like Queen Sono and Blood and Water, and they're making waves internationally. Other news stories haven't been so good. Like what's up with Peace Prize de Klerk and Madame Helen Zille just chirping that apartheid wasn't so bad and colonialism had its upside. Hey, we black people are just sitting here minding our own business, and then you just come in and swiggle us like that. Listen. We're divided enough as a society. These are complex, unresolved issues. You cannot solve hundreds of years of racism with a tweet. It just doesn't end well. Just ask Donald Trump. Actually, please don't. Just don't. On a more serious note, the Zondo Commission grinds on and on with no clear direction, no convictions, and no end in sight. Remember, this process was supposed to clear out the rot of the previous, let's call it regime, setting a fresh new stage for a glorious recovery. Instead, we got nothing much. I know that the wheels of justice turn slowly, but couldn't we buy justice a new car? To be fair, though, things do seem to be moving forward a bit now, with a few high-profile arrests by the NPA and more on the way. All I can say is, go Shamila, bring on those orange overalls. We've seen how the state was captured. Now we want to see the state do some capturing. The good news is that the virus has, in many ways, brought the rest of the world down to our level. No, think about it. Now, America has a huge unemployment rate. Britain can't seem to formulate a single coherent policy. And the European Union is fighting like stray cats in a Sea Point alley. And BRICS, remember when we were the poor little cousin in BRICS? Well, China. Let's just say stop eating bats, ne? And India, they gave a country of 1.3 billion people 4 hours notice. 4 hours before going into total lockdown. Brazil, they're digging mass graves in the Amazon while their president calls coronavirus a hoax invented by his enemies. Anyway, at least we're all in the cuck together, and South Africa is looking comparatively sane next to some of our global partners. So good for us, ne? I suppose. Is that good news? Does anybody know? I mean, I can't tell anymore.
Thank you, Tumi. things move so fast. So just after we finished shooting that video last week, the Electoral Act was found unconstitutional, opening space for independent candidates in national and provincial elections. So that's going to have an interesting effect on the 2024 elections. And then a drug that's produced here in South Africa was found to be very effective in reducing COVID mortality. So this emotional roller coaster, it's going to keep going, right? There's going to be good news, bad news, news we don't quite know the meaning of. So where is our anchor in this? Let's look at the hard trends. So what is new this year is that in the COVID environment, we have shortened the period of time covered by the data in our barometers. So ordinarily, we compile secondary data that is published between July and June every year. So normally it would have been July 2019 to June 2020 this year, but we have cut it off at February. So that what I'm going to be presenting to you now is the pre-COVID trend. Secondly, as we've already heard, we are for the first time this year able to look at a year-on-year trend in the scenarios barometers. And then finally, possibly most importantly, for the first time, we have prepared a provincial barometer, which looks at the scenario direction in each province. All right, so the barometer composition is made up of 53 indicators, all of which are based on secondary data published by reputable national and international organizations. So this is all data that's already in the public sphere. We haven't produced any data ourselves for this project. The intention here is not to replicate other larger data sets like the National Development Plan indicators or the Sustainable Development Goal reporting indicators, but rather to provide a sort of canary in the gold mine effect. So early warning signs for a wide range of underlying conditions. The indicators are divided up into 3 driving forces that underpin the scenario narratives. So as you can see on the screen, there are distinct dimensions within each key driving force as well. And within each dimension, there are specific indicators. So as an example, under state capacity within the institutional capacity and leadership key driving force, we have Auditor General reports for state entities, we have municipal functionality as reported by COGTA, and we have the reliability of basic service provision in power and in water. So for each indicator then, we determine a level at which outcomes would fall into which scenario. So for example, to measure state capacity at the local level, we look at municipal functionality. If under 10% of our municipalities are dysfunctional, we would be in the Nailiwak scenario, the cohesive scenario. If between 10 and 25% of our municipalities were dysfunctional, we'd be in Isibujwa. More than that, and we're in Gwara. So this year, COGTA has reported 50% dysfunctional municipalities, so deeply in Gwara on that indicator. Gives you an example of how we set up the entire barometer. All right, let's start by looking at our key driving forces. What are the results? Yellow in this picture is the Nailiwak scenario. Turquoise is our status quo Isibujwa scenario, and olive is the demoralized Gwara. So yes, we know green is normally the good color, so it's a bit counterintuitive, but we're trying to keep you on your toes. If you look down in the right-hand corner of your screen, you can see the colors in the scenario's names if you need to remember them. So when we look at how people are feeling about the country this year, our key driving force, resistance, resentment, reconciliation, we see that half of our indicators point to the Isibujwa scenario, and there are some positive indicators in the Nailiwak scenario and a substantial drag into Gwara. This year, when we look at institutional capacity and leadership, it's balanced between Isibujwa and Gwara, both at 38%. But there's also a quarter of indicators with very positive signs in Nailiwak, so that's good. Now, For those of you who saw this presentation last year, you can imagine what's coming. For those of you not, what do you think our status is in the social inequality dimension? So there we go. Most sobering. When we compare ourselves with targets that the country has set for ourselves, as well as international comparisons, we're very far behind on social inequality. So the underlying socio-economic conditions for the majority of South Africans in terms of employment, health, education, safety, are pulling us strongly into the divisive Gwara-Gwara scenario. The one positive indicator within this dimension is that overall life expectancy continues to rise. So let's hope it stays that way. So how does this compare to last year's position? If we look at the last socioeconomic dimension, there's really not been much change. That's largely because most of the indicators were already so bad that we couldn't downgrade them into another scenario. In case you are wondering, there will be a revision of the scenario narratives that we are starting towards the end of this year. And so we will see if that changes the picture for next year's report. In both of the other key driving forces, we see that the Gwara-Gwara scenario has become stronger, with indicators slipping from both the other two scenarios. So if we put all of this together into a single national story, which scenario do we land in? We have landed across the midway line into the Gwara-Gwara scenario, a land of disorder and decay. And compared to last year's assessment, this was quite a significant decline, from 46% to 52%. So which indicators specifically moved to get us to this point? 1 year is not a long time, and so most of the original 52 indicators remained the same, or remained in the same scenario at least. However, 6 indicators moved between the scenarios. 5 moved down, if you want to put it that way, and 1 moved up. In terms of how people feel about the country, so our RRR scenario, or our key driving force, there's a 32% difference between the number of black and white South Africans who believe that land redistribution is necessary for reconciliation, according to the SA Reconciliation Barometer. I don't think I have to tell you which one's higher and which one's lower. In terms of optimism in the economic outlook of the country, 49% of South Africans were optimistic, as measured in January by Ipsos, compared to 52% measured in early 2019. So that also took us down a scenario. Both of those are not good conditions for a cohesive conversation. Under institutional capacity and leadership, we all know the power support has worsened. Certainly everybody in Soweto this past week is very aware of that. The Department of Water reported 69% of municipalities providing reliable and safe drinking water. That's just not enough, so we had to take that down a level. On climate policy, even though government approved the Integrated Resource Plan in October 2019, which has many positive policy shifts towards cleaner energy, the Climate Action Tracker internationally nonetheless rates South Africa as highly insufficient. We're just not yet doing enough. In May 2019, elections did improve youth representation in Parliament to well above the global average. We're now at 12%. I think the global average is 6%. So that's positive, and that's bumped up that indicator. What you see at the bottom of the screen here is the example of municipal functionality. So I've already mentioned that stat. Last year, 33% of municipalities were reported as dysfunctional. So that was already in Gwara-Gwara, but now it's slipped to 50%. So that's a very worrying trend. This could partly be about COGTA getting more transparent about its measurements, though. So that's actually a good thing, which brings us to the next, I think, really important insight in this barometer process, which is that we have a severe challenge in our overall ability to lead and institutionally manage change, which is that there's a lack of measurement of key indicators of the country's well-being and success. So in this year's barometer, we weren't able to find new data on poverty, on inequality, on greenhouse gas emissions, on ECD quality, because they simply either aren't measured regularly or are not published. Maternal and under 5 mortality rates, which we absolutely must be reporting internationally on, it's not compiled or publicly available. So this data challenge is really not allowing us to manage these trends very well. All right, let us move on to perceptions, the result of our perception survey. This is data we did generate ourselves this year. We spoke to 900 people across the country. Because in addition to having good data, the other thing you need to make change is an awareness of the need for change and the desire to change and a sense that change is possible. So perceptions are absolutely crucial here. So in late May, we asked 900 people to compare how they felt about the country just before COVID in January and February, and now during the COVID crisis. And we asked which scenario they foresee coming true in the next 12 months. So as you can see on the left of your screen, overall South Africans are a fairly optimistic bunch, 27% seeing a socially cohesive Nailewok emerging from COVID. But if we look at it by race group, by population group, we see there's a big difference. So who is the most optimistic? Black South Africans, by far. If we look at it by age, again, look at this trend, it's just amazing. Younger people are much more likely to foresee social cohesion. The elderly, not at all. See, there's no yellow there on the right-hand bar. So who will have to drive the social compacting towards the Nailewok scenario? Clearly, it has to be young Black South Africans. So those older white people amongst us, including me, we must get out of the way. All right, let me move on to the other big novelty this year, which is the Provincial Barometer. In addition to a vision of a desired future, we need specific spaces within which to compact for such a future. And this can't only be at national level. So provinces are a very important space for social compacting to take place, which is why we've generated this Provincial Indlulamithi Barometer for the first time this year. While our provinces have many natural and historical differences, which make them difficult to compare, of course, we are focusing on the governance aspects, since that is what we can influence in terms of moving towards a socially cohesive South Africa. So the Provincial Barometer indicators is a subset of the National Barometer indicators. We've used as many of the same indicators as we could. The biggest difference is in the institutional capacity key driving force, since most of the national indicators don't apply to provinces. So we only have 5 indicators here, which is financial management, based on Auditor General reports, municipal functionality, as already mentioned, reliable water provision, based on DWAF reports, and then gender and youth representation in provincial legislatures. So we understand that this does not reflect everything that is happening in provinces, but to repeat, the intention is to provide high-level canary indicators. By looking at a range of indicators across the key driving forces, the intention is to see our provinces holistically and identify both opportunities to build on towards cohesiveness, as well as challenges to be addressed through compacting. So let's start by looking at institutional capacity and leadership. It's perhaps not surprising to see the 2 economic powerhouses provinces at the top of the list, Western Cape and Gauteng. But then we have Limpopo and Eastern Cape right behind them. And this is because they both have strong youth and gender representation in their provincial parliaments, and this is really important. Looking at social inequality, Limpopo does well again because it has low inequality, good nutrition access, a low under 5 mortality rate, and a low homicide rate. So this is just one example of how looking at a range of indicators can allow us to see things differently and to observe potential for different future paths. The Eastern Cape, while having one positive indicator on nutrition access, is the province most deeply in the Gwara scenario on social inequality. Now, if we look at our resistance, resentment, reconciliation dimension. So how people feel about each other and about the country. We have a completely different picture. Mpumalanga and the Northern Cape have the strongest Nailewak results. In Mpumalanga, people have among the highest levels of trust in the courts. They feel that there is strong freedom of speech, strong civil society freedom. They have optimism about the country's economy, and they value their national identity over their ethnic identities. All strong indicators of social cohesion. In contrast, the Western Cape and Gauteng in this dimension are quite low in the list. So, how people feel about each other and about the country is not directly dependent on the province's institutions or their personal socio-economic circumstances, and they provide all sorts of opportunities for compacting towards cohesion. So if we put all of that together into the aggregate barometer for provinces, we do see that the Western Cape, Limpopo, and Gauteng have strong opportunities for continuing to build a socially cohesive Nailewak scenario, while the Eastern Cape and the Northwest are most strongly in the divisive Gwara-Gwara scenario and will need to work hard to compact, to move in a different direction. So the barometers, both the national barometer and the provincial barometers, they are designed to focus us on where we are so that we can have a conversation about where we want to go from here. As we stand on the doorway of Gwara-Gwara, how do we get to a socially cohesive Nailewak scenario from here? The next presentation gives us some ideas as an answer to this question. But the real question is how each individual, each one of us, makes decisions every day to take us in a direction that we want to go. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much. South Africa faces a number of challenges and is going through two major crises. The first crisis is COVID-19, a health pandemic accompanied by negative demand, supply, and price shocks. Secondly, there has been a chronic crisis, one which is persistent, and there has been low growth and high rate of poverty, unemployment, and inequality. The question then that we have to ask is, how is South Africa going to emerge out of this particular crisis? What are the likely economic impacts of coronavirus pandemic, and what mix of policies are likely to mitigate the negative impact of the virus and propel the economy on a Nailewak path? For this, we have used a national provincial model of South Africa to quantify the impact of the pandemic and to examine our policy choices for the next 10 years. We try to look at the questions, which is, if there were no COVID-19 and the status quo remained unchanged, what would be likely economic outlook for South Africa over the next decade? In this regard, we look at the average GDP growth of less than 2% if we sustain this. The unemployment rate will remain high. More than 1/3 of the population will still be in poverty by 2030. The inequality remain high. In our view, this is the East bourgeois outlook for the country without the coronavirus, represented by the policy status quo on trickle-down outcomes of low growth, high unemployment, and high poverty and inequality. We look at another scenario of what if the policy status quo is unchanged, even with COVID-19? What is the economic likely future of South Africa? And to design this scenario and use the model that we have just spoken about, we looked at 6 scenarios. And these 6 scenarios are combined of 3 scenarios for the domestic spread of the pandemic and its containment, and 2 scenarios for the spillover effects of the international crisis. These scenarios are displayed before you there for the COVID-19 scenarios. They generate the following quantification. More specifically, for each of the 6 COVID-19 scenarios, we quantitatively define shocks to 4 variables, namely household consumption, investment, production, and employment. And this will be due to infection and containment measures such as the lockdown order, social distancing, and isolation. Furthermore, for each of the 6 COVID scenarios, we specified shocks to 6 additional variables due to the international spillover effects, and this includes our exports, imports, exchange rate, and FDI. The model was then run with these COVID-19 scenarios and the status quo policies, and the results are shown on the screen as follows. The scenarios give us the following results. COVID-19 will have a major impact on the economy depending on the COVID-19 scenario. The real GDP growth for 2020 is likely to drop to between -4.8 and 16.86%. Unemployment rate is likely to increase to between 35 and 40%. Poverty rate is likely to increase by between 4 and 7 percentage points, increasing the number of the poor from between 2.5 and 4.5 million. Economic transition will neither be quick nor uniform. Negative economic impacts of the pandemic is expected to persist in the medium term. Overall, over time, economic indicators tend to gravitate towards the low growth, high unemployment, and poverty trends established by the policy status quo scenario. The next question, what if COVID-19 status quo? What if COVID status quo what if COVID-19 changes the policy status quo, and what mix of policies are likely to mitigate the impact of the virus and propel the economy on an either walk, inclusive growth path? For this, we have utilized various government policies, tools, without ring-fencing any. And for this, we have advocated for a 6-pillar policy bridge. The 6 policy bridge looks at macroeconomic policy reforms, social policy reforms, microeconomic policy reforms, trade and industry, international support, private support, as well as provincial GDPs. What then do we get from the macroeconomic policy reform pillar? We look at this macroeconomic first pillar, a bridge from the macroeconomic reform point of view. What we get from this is it includes suggestions for the use of fiscal and monetary policy to mitigate the current crisis. And we look also at the post-COVID-19 scenario, which includes reforming fiscal and monetary policy to become more supportive of economic growth, public and private investment, and delivery of public services. We then look at social policy reforms, which is the next pillar. The social policy reforms look at a number of reforms, and these include social policy reforms, specific measures such as the unemployment grant for those who lost their jobs due to the COVID-19, expansion of public works and provision of caregiver grant to help mitigate the immediate impact of the pandemic. And we look at social policy measures for post-COVID-19 to help those left behind, especially the unskilled unemployed, from poverty and social exclusion. Microeconomic pillar is next, and that is about microeconomic policies. And this pillar in itself, we look at this, includes various proposals to increase efficiency and competitiveness of South African economy. The next pillar that we look at is trade and industry policy reform. And the trade and industry pillar reform includes various and industrial policy measures that are designed to increase investment in manufacturing, increase exports, and reduce economic sectors' dependency on imports. We then look at the next pillar, which is the fifth pillar, which is a policy pillar for domestic and international private sector support. Under this pillar, we capture initiatives such as the PPGI investment plan, possible investment by PIC in the manufacturing sector, and increase in FDI. The private sector pillar looks at potential contributions of provincial growth, or rather, the private sector pillar looks at, I've run ahead of myself here. The private sector pillar captures such as initiatives as PPGI, PIC, and the manufacturing sector. The next pillar that we look at is the provincial growth and development plans from the provinces. Under this pillar, we look at the potential contributions of provincial growth and development plans themselves. And these provincial growth development plans are shown behind there. The question then is, what are the conclusions that we arrive at in relation to these interventions, the six-pillar bridge? The conclusions that we come to is that this will reduce the negative impact of COVID-19 and growth, the impact on employment as well as on poverty. It shortens the recovery period, produces average annual growth of 6%, over 6%, creates 8.2 million jobs over the next decade, reduces the unemployment rate by 2/3 to 15% by 2030, lowers the poverty rate by 40% to 24%, and reduces the income inequality by 11 percentage points. What does this mean for inclusive growth? The six-pillar policy bridge produces an Naila walk path with inclusive growth. The six-pillar policy bridge gives us a significant impact on poverty, on working class, and on the private sector. On the poor, national poverty rate declines by about 45% from 43% to 24% between 2020 to 2030. Poverty levels decline during the next decade by 1/3 from 23%, from 23.4 million to 15.7 million. Significant improvements in the service delivery of and land reform, housing, economic infrastructure across the country occurs in this period. What happens to the working class? For the working class, unemployment rate declines, 8.2 million jobs are created, national income inequality is reduced by 11 percentage points, and significant improvements are made in the service delivery environment. What happens then to the business class? The real GDP more than doubles in this period from the 3.5 to 6.5 trillion. Average profit remains at 16%. Improvements in the economy and overall well-being of the population improved average labor productivity. And government debt to GDP ratio reduces. Average investment GDP increases to 28%, and there is an increase in social cohesion. What then are the key success factors? Because these things cannot happen on their own. The key success factors for the Naylor Walk scenario is that we should secure model-based tools for planning, monitoring, and evaluation. We need to train the public service in the use of these models so that they can consult on them for their policy design, for planning and implementation. We need to get the executive to use the tools as the eye of the needle and forward-looking evidence for successful planning and implementation. We need to get the public and the legislature to apply these tools for oversight on delivery by the executive. And finally, if it is about a different post-COVID-19 era, we need to start now. The information has been compiled with the assistance, great assistance from ADRS. Thank you.
Don't have any questions, isn't it? Do we have any questions? Are there any? We're now into the Q&A session of the presentation. We have received one question. The question is for Tara. I'm going to read it out aloud. Thank you for the highly informative and transparent exercise. I cannot say that the barometer results strike any optimism, but instead, it makes the future look more grim and worrying for the state and the youth who will inherit a very fractured state despite their optimism in the perception barometer. My question is the political leadership, namely the government, aware of this critical exercise, and what is their take or commitment to addressing these issues? What future do we see for our youth? Over to you, Tara.
Thank you very much for that question.
Sorry, there's
Yes.
also another part to this question.
Yes.
It says, please define older white people, in quotes, and why we should get out of the way. How is that a constitutionally acceptable sentiment?
All right. Thank you. So to the first question of this exercise, and as I think all of the introductory statements have said, the entire Indulamithi project team has been working closely with many different layers of government, as well as with really all the other sectors in society. And that's the value of this project, is to have those conversations. So we're not here to provide a prescription. We are here to sort of galvanize a conversation. And so the commitment to addressing these issues has to come from all parts of society. I mean, we've certainly seen a lot of commitment out of a range of different senior government officials that the team has spoken with. But it is a collective commitment. It's about social compacting and not about waiting for one part of society to do it by itself. And so the future that we see for our youth, well, I mean, I think that's precisely the point of this exercise, is that if we can imagine a future, if we can vision a future, and if we can have the conversations that allow us to share that vision, then we have a much better chance of getting there than if we're not even having those conversations, if we're complaining or if we're looking backwards rather than looking forwards. So that's the value of what we're trying to bring to the conversation. Older white people, so that's my personal opinion, but it comes out of looking at where do the perceptions seem to be about a positive future. And, you know, the question is just who's leading the public debates, who's leading the actions in our communities and in our politics. And it's really just a call to recognize the voices that are bringing forward really positive visions of the future, and to give those voices as much space as possible, because that's really where the future lies.
Thank you very much, Tara, for those answers. I think that brings to an end the questions that we have. It now gives me a great honor and a pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Honorable Tandy Modise, the Member of Parliament, Speaker of the National Assembly in the Republic of South Africa. Ms. Modise is the current Speaker of the National Assembly in the 6th administration. She was the chairperson of the National Council of Provinces, NCOP, during the 5th Democratic Parliament. She is currently the Chancellor of the Cape Peninsula University of Technology, a position she has held since September 2017. Ms. Modise was first elected to Parliament in 1994 and served as the chairperson of several parliamentary committees, such as the Portfolio Committee on Defense, the Joint Standing Committee on Defense, and the Ad Hoc Committee for Ratification of the Convention to Eliminate All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. She has also been a Speaker of the Northwest Provincial Legislature from 2004 to 2009, and the Premier of the Northwest from 2010 to 2014. She has a long history of participation in the struggle for freedom from apartheid, starting with the 1976 student uprising. It included exile in Botswana and Angola, and military training while in exile. A minority of women undergoing such training for the African National Congress, the ANC. Ms. Modise serves as a member of the ANC National Executive Committee. She also served as Deputy President and Acting President of the ANC's Women's League. She was also Deputy Secretary General of the ANC from 2007 to 2012, amongst other positions. Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me an honor to welcome our next speaker to address us.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fikeni, the leadership of Indlulamithi, for inviting me to share today's important occasion with you. Let me start off by congratulating you on the launch of the Provincial Barometers. As a former leader in the province, it is the most important barometers that you are going to have, because planning at a national level in South Africa with provinces that actually have semi-federal powers is difficult. So it is important for us to say it is a step in the right direction, and we wish you all the best with it. I'm also saying that I'm very happy that South Africa is in a no-surrender spirit. This pandemic is not going to get us down. We are going to have to stand up and take advantage of a crisis that must enable us to look back, to look at the current, and to plan better, and perhaps the space that we are being given by the virus, confining us to our homes and our offices at home, is just the right space for us to look more critically at ourselves, more critically at the capacities that the state has, and to begin to do things which we should have done since 1994. Now, the IMF recent report indicates that many countries face a multi-layered challenge of health shocks, of domestic economic disruptions, of almost zero external trade, of capital flow reverses, and of collapsing commodity prices. So we are in it. Our economy was on its knees long before COVID-19 came. We can accept that our economic uncertainties will last for us a little bit longer than we thought. We can also expect that investment will be long in coming. We are hearing calls for national protectionism globally. We even hear our people beginning to despair. And we can't say that we ourselves, we are not worried, because we look at things and we know that we must shift things. Government has started doing this. They have shifted monies from an already strained budget to try and mitigate the negative impact of COVID-19, especially amongst the most vulnerable amongst ourselves. But that simply means that shifting the budget from where it was into dealing with the crisis means that a lot more is going to be left undone unless dynamic leadership comes to the fore, better planning is put in, Parliament is on the toes to guard at every little cent that has moved from the left to the right and to wherever it is. So for me, it is important that today we come here because government in South Africa must continue to provide the basics. And that water, that sanitation, that feeding scheme at school, that free medication for the indigent, which sometimes disappears, that shelter which the people need. We need to continue to do that, because if we don't do that, and if we don't focus on building an economy that can enable South Africans to begin to look after themselves rather than to continue to depend on these basics that the government gives, we will not be able to get out of Gwara. In fact, we might get into a state which is worse than Gwara. We also accept that inequality has increased in South Africa. This COVID-19 has pointed that out to us. We know that we boast that 10 million children in 20,000 no-fee schools in South Africa have an enrollment of 99% in 2015. That's great. It still doesn't make these children in the no-fee schools equal to the rest of their peers. We also know that we feed 9 out of 12 million children at school. It still does not lessen the hunger throughout South Africa. So it is not that we're not doing something. It is the direction of the doing that we must begin to address. It is the leadership and the supervision that we need to be looking at. Now, our National Development Plan envisioned a developmental state, which means a capacity within the state itself, which means that Parliament must be capacitated to be able to understand, to analyze, to criticize, not only to criticize, but also to make recommendations. It means that the Parliament, having been given the responsibility by the Constitution to represent, but also to ensure that public education and public participation by the general public in the affairs of government happens, must begin to do what it was established to do. We must begin to be there. We must create that capacity. And if we can't create that capacity, we must find different ways of capacitating members so that your man, your child, your woman who is dying of GBV in the streets and in the households of South Africa feels that we are not just sitting there to listen to stories from the executive, to talk amongst ourselves, to argue, and not to do that which is important for them. And that is to begin to talk to South Africans as Parliament, as the representatives of the people. What is our national interest? Do we have one? Why is it so easy for South Africans to see themselves in different corners rather than to come together in times of crisis? What is it about us that we cannot forget petty, racial, gender squabbles at a time of a crisis and begin to say, but I put my country first? What is it that has not happened to Parliament in the last elections? Firstly, we've increased the numbers of women. We should be proud as South Africa that with a woman-heavy Parliament, your policies, your supervision is going to be more focused, because we watch the little sense because we know they count. We should be proud that more and more young people have joined Parliament. It means that my age begins to feel relaxed in training and handing over to people who will be more vigorous in putting the executive to account. It means that these young people will look more critically at policies that are brought to our doorsteps, at treaties that sometimes we sign off without saying to the executive, we do not agree. We do not want our country to participate here. But it also means that with young people, you have people training to take over the leadership of their country. You have people who are focused on productivity. You have people who should focus on national cohesion, because if they start going disarray, this generation of young people, then we have no future, then we have no country into the future. It is these young people, these women, who must work hard to ensure that these standards by which our country is judged with, it will not just be the 3 scenarios, the SDGs at the UN, the Agenda 2063 is bringing its own standards. The region has its own. We participate throughout this continent on peacekeeping missions. We negotiate, we host, we second. All those are resources that South Africa needs to do. So being in a junk status means we need to pull up all our resources. I've been quite impressed, Dr. Fikeni, over the last 3 weeks, because I've noticed that more and more young South Africans, and yes, black South Africans, are coming out innovative. They're putting up businesses which are addressing the needs of this COVID, but are also pushing us into this robotic age that we are moving into. So for me, I would say, yes, Isibujwa, we are there. Headaches, but flickers of hope are there. I think that we need to be on our toes to make sure that we don't slip into this guara into Ntwena. But I'm also saying that what is my role as a parliamentarian? Firstly, I'm very happy that I will manage to get the report into Parliament. I will manage to push it, especially through the chairpersons of committees, because it is important. You cannot follow up and make recommendations. You cannot look at plans. You cannot look at performance if you do not understand the direction. And this report should be helping us to say to chairpersons, this is what you look for. This is not just the Auditor General's report. This is the public sentiment. This is when you lose it. And I know countries who have really worked, produced, but still lost themselves into areas we don't want to see South Africa degenerating into. So I would want to say congratulations. Thank you very much for bringing us here. We ourselves must now get into these scenarios. We ourselves must make sure that when we ask questions, we are informed. We ourselves must make sure that when we do our oversight in the provinces, in the municipalities, we know what to say and what to look after. So I thank you very much, sir, for inviting us here. Thank you.
Thank you very much to the Honorable Speaker for the keynote address. We have received more questions, so I'd like to read these questions out to you. The first one is a general question. It says, thank you for the presentations and perspectives. Regarding climate change indicators, emissions are just one. The other is temperature increases. South Africa is deemed a climate hotspot in UN climate science, IPCC. This means we are hitting at twice the global average. We have already overshot 2 degrees as a country. On the current emissions trajectory, we will be facing more multi-year droughts, extreme flooding, and increasing economic costs. A highly unequal society will be facing catastrophic realities in this context. I hope the scenarios take on board the heating trends and says all the best. This is Dr. Satgar at Wits University. Who wants to have a shot at that? Prof?
Well, I would simply say that one of the mega trends that we have factored into our own scenarios has been the one of climate change and environmental degradation. It's one of the most important that you can't ignore. That South Africa has experienced drought, especially in the Western Cape, parts of the Eastern Cape and Northern Cape, is a wake-up call to say this is no longer something remote. This is no longer something you hear in the global summits. So we can use the opportunity like this one to say, how do we secure in future the harvesting of clean water? How do we make sure that the carbon emissions are reduced to the bare minimum? A crisis like COVID does one other thing. It gives us an opportunity to reflect how to do things differently. Some satellite images were showing that countries like China, cities like Beijing, Mumbai, all of a sudden didn't have the fog that is always hanging in there. So it was a time for the earth to heal. And it's also time for South Africans to begin to say, how do we do things in a manner that doesn't impact environment in a negative way? In a way, the ecosystem of things, when we come out of a lockdown, we should know that we have to coexist with the environment.
Thank you, Prof. Any question, any comments from your side, Tara? Okay.
Yes, I think one of the things that the model-based planning takes into account going forward is matters of climate change. What are the economic impacts on climate and what are the impacts of climate on economic? And I think by looking at these models, we should be able to articulate between those. Yes. So that's what should be taken into account going forward. But the model allows for that.
Thank you for that. Then the second question is for Dr. Fikeni. Thank you for the interesting session. I'd like to know how you approach the question of technology in scenario development. Do you make assumptions on both technology development and uptake? How is the Indlulamithi scenarios going to make sure the structural and systemic poverty, inequality, and unemployment is reduced?
Well, I do think that in all our reports, including the barometer and the economic modeling, and the main report itself puts inequality as probably the most important factor we should be looking for. That the tension, the resistance, the resentment, even reconciliation itself would depend on what we do to make sure that the inequalities are addressed. Now, one of the things when we talk of the fourth industrial revolution is the issue of the digital divide. When we were talking about children coming back to school, the issue of technology and the discrepancies that are beginning to show became very obvious. The issue of this was also a test in terms of our communication infrastructure, the broadband infrastructure, to say, if we're working from home, we have what it takes. Or does the government has to move with great speed in making sure that it relaxes some of the restrictions which are there, or enables the country to operate at a level where such innovations are coming? But on top of that, I think the point that our keynote speaker was making, you're beginning to see young people seizing the opportunity to innovate in response to COVID. Such innovation, such startup companies ought to be a trend now for young people, because not everyone is going to be employed, but opportunities can be opened for people to start businesses by simply coming up with solutions to the problems that people are facing.
Thanks very much, Prof, for that response. Now I have the last question for Dr. Padile Hotla. So the question to you is, what has changed between 2012, when the NDP was published, and these 6-pillar policy reforms? I see similar interventions, but hoping for a different outcome. As someone once said, doing the same things over and over, but expecting a different result. We need more courageous change in more fundamental drivers. For example, political leadership and accountability, policy alignment and coherence, shift from trickle-down development, awful education outcomes, etc. What lessons can be taken globally for a quick economic recovery, given the historical triple challenges in South Africa? A slow growth will create economic and social instability. So that's the question.
Thanks for the question. I suppose trying to present policy scenarios remotely within such a short period of time and expect us to really engage fully would be expecting too much. But what the 6-pillar policy scenarios put out, it's quite different from what we have been having since 2012, probably since 1994. On the 6 pillars, there are 2 pillars where since 1994 up to now, there is coincidence. It is the macroeconomic policy reform and trade and industry policy reform. When we tested and simulated this, it showed that the effects will be very minimal. In fact, what the budget speech and MTBPs provided was exactly both trade and industry and macroeconomic policy reform. Excluded from that, in the main, is the macroeconomic reform. What the role of the bank would be, what should be expanded, and particularly in the era of COVID-19. What the lending or extension of credit, particularly to small businesses, is. The macroeconomic position has remained the same. It hasn't changed. And that's the pillar that we need and seek to say should change. The social policy is very expansionary in our proposal, and it differs from the period between 2012 and now, including the expansion on the EPWP. The next pillar is the provincial GDPs, growth and development programs, where we actually have tested with Gauteng that it is possible that the province plans can actually be expansionary and lead to growth. The private sector support and international support, in this we are looking at FDIs as the last support, but the private sector support, PIC engaging and probably putting 100 billion, 20 billion helping the manufacturing sector to grow. All these are very, very fundamental, and simulating this model shows that growth of 6% is possible, shows that we can actually increase the number of people employed by 8.2 million in the next 10 years, unlike the 1 million that the budget speech proposed in Parliament this year. So there are fundamental shifts in this. And of course, the question is welcome, but in the short space that we have, it's very difficult to expatiate on this. And there is a report that we'll table that actually shows and proves ahead of time that these things are possible. And therefore, model-based, seeing ahead of time, and asking the hard questions as to, do we accept 1 million jobs, or should we accept 8.5 million, is the role that Parliament should actually play as an oversight role into the executive. What are the deliverables, and monitor those tightly. It is not about what we can do. It's about what we should do. The way we have answered questions in the country is what we can do. That's all we can do. That's all. It is about what should we do, and this model suggests what we should do.
Thank you, Prof. There's another question for you here. It says, the Isibujwa economic projection by Dr. Lehotla is quite optimistic and can look unattainable given the current state of the economy. 2 questions. Will that scenario allow for appropriate macroeconomic balances? Secondly, what should be the global trends in that scenario? The 6-pillar policy bridge is encouraging. I'd like to know, how is this received by our government at all levels? Is there any buy-in from their side? Maybe you may have covered some of this, but you may want us to go over that quickly.
Yes, the Isibujwa scenario, we have demonstrated that it's not going to take us anywhere, even in the absence of COVID-19. It still yields high unemployment. It still yields deeper poverty, and it still yields inequality. And that's what we presented to Parliament in February. That was a Isibujwa scenario. COVID has come deepening the challenge to that scenario. And the 6-pillar scenario is actually addressing some of the legacy problems of unemployment that have been there all the time, And I think it's for Parliament, it's for the executive, it's for South Africa Incorporated, the business, to look at this. In the presentation of these scenarios, as early as last year, August, September, business has actually been listening. The key question they ask is, where will the money come from? Are you not having a welfare state? When we confront these issues in a discourse with business, they actually listen. Because in the presentation, we show where the money should come from. The question is whether the investment summits actually bring new money or just churn existing plans. I think if we have 500 billion new money, growing to about $1 trillion as we expect, but that becomes new money from private business. We've incorporated that in our 500 billion suggestion. We've also said 100 billion from the PIC. All those together, and looking at the expansion of social policies, all those together can yield a different results, but it is the simultaneity of these 6 pillars. It's not one after the other, it's a simultaneity of that. More importantly, is for government to have the tools to see ahead. At the moment, we don't have those tools that see ahead. Our plans are belly gazing, navel gazing. They don't look ahead. We don't have a modeling capability. I would like to see one. The NDP was a document. It didn't have any technical processes or tools and people who are equipped to deal with modeling. Those are fundamental problems, and we are not going to go anywhere unless we start addressing those. So it's having the tools to execute the intentions. It's having the capacity of the individuals, the civil servants, because yes, here we are looking at our input into this. We are not policymakers. We are just people outside, experts doing certain things. But for this to succeed, it has to be driven by government, because those are the people who are elected.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We've come to the end of our question and answer session. Now we're going to move to the next item on the agenda, which is the vote of thanks. And really I'd like just to make some few remarks. I just want to start off by saying that the confluence of the COVID-19 pandemic, the South Africa's sovereign ratings downgrade, the results of the National and Provincial Barometer is putting before us a compelling case for change. The spotlight is once again shining on the socio-economic fault lines in South Africa. There is clear evidence before us that the country is gravitating towards the scenario or a pathway towards the future that is less desirable, both the floundering false dawn and the enclaved bourgeoisie nation. Things have to change because the world, as we are used to, is changing fast before our own eyes. As institutions, businesses, organizations, labor, civil society, and corporations, in our quest to develop long-term strategies, these have to be viewed or looked at through the lens of the Indulamithi scenarios. There are things that we need to preserve, to protect and defend. Chief amongst these is our shared destiny, our economy, our common nationhood, solidarity, social cohesion, and to never allow the current crisis to go to waste. We must harness and nurture our ability to imagine a future which binds us together, a future that rids us all of those things that divide us and keep us apart, a future that leaves no one behind. However, taking a forward step in building an inclusive future, a future where everyone has a voice, a future where all voices matter and that they count, will require collaborative energy, resolve, determination, compromises, and commitment of all leaders across the various sectors of society. At this critical juncture, we have an opportunity to construct the kind of future that we can identify with, an inclusive future where everyone feels that they belong to and they can lay claim to it. Critical junctures are major events that disrupt the balance, either politically or economically, and presents a unique opportunity to usher in a new order and a new way of doing things. We need to work as a collective with renewed vigor, resolve, and determination towards improving the quality of life of all citizens and free the potential of each person so that they can feel that they belong and that they are not left behind. The time for a social compact has come. The time for us to get together to make amends has come. The time to course correct and to reach out to one another and socially contract on the desired future is now. The social compact is our chance to give up something in return for something better that we currently have. Social compact must be in the form of a dialogue, either at industry level or at sectorial level, provincially or nationally, to promote the interest of all partners. Through social dialogue, consultation and information sharing should be encouraged between partners to work towards common interests. What are the sacrifices and the compromises that we are willing to make today that will secure for us all a better environment, a better future, and live in a nation in one step, to live in a nation that celebrates excellence, diversity, and inclusive spirit, where no one is left behind, a better country whose legacy we can confidently bequeath to future generations. This is our moment to step up and make the social compact and follow the examples of countries that have been able to rebuild their economies and reconstruct their societies on the back of a social compact, such as South Korea, Singapore, the Netherlands, Sweden, Ireland, and Rwanda. As the Indlulamithi team, we are ready and willing to make ourselves available to engage with all the various stakeholders across the board as we take the work further of developing new scenarios that incorporate the new world of COVID-19 and the socio-economic reality of South Africa. Finally, I'd like to thank the leadership group of the Indlulamithi scenarios, the steering committee, the financial sponsors, the media, the organizers, the participants, and everyone who has contributed to make this day possible. I'm told that there's about 339 people that are participating in this webinar. I'd like to thank you for your attendance and participation in today's event. May you continue to look above the trees. I will now leave the last words for Ms. Tumi Morake with the wrap-up of Giraffe Neck News.
And so, As we near the end of our show, only one burning question remains. If you had to pick a song to describe the year ahead, what would it be? Yes, we asked over 900 people to choose their song of the year, and here are the results. Drum roll, please. And the second runner-up is that place. So why don't you just say that place? Anyway, at number 3, Heal the World by Michael Jackson. Great song, problematic singer. Let's move on. In second place, it's Senzenina, that powerful anthem of endurance and solidarity. Senzenina, Senzenina. And a surprise win for the national anthem of South Africa. Yes, Nkosi Sikelel has been chosen by you as the song that sums up the year ahead. Really, guys, I mean, that's beautiful. Wait till you're going to make me cry. Actually, you know what? South Africa, come closer. We need to talk. South Africa, my friend, let's get real. We've been through a lot. And this whole pandemic is just traumatic, truly. We're all going through trauma on a daily basis. So it's okay to try, just to cry a bit, you know? It's okay to feel despair. It's okay to admit that you're scared. Because personally speaking, I am pooping myself. I don't want to let my kids go back to school. I don't want to see people I love losing their jobs. I don't even know what day it is half the time. And that's okay. This is about survival, day-to-day survival. And if there's one thing we know as South Africans, it's how to survive. Our history is filled with tears and trauma. But each time we are down, you know, we roll over and we get back on our feet. Like one of those inflatable clowns that you punch and then they just come back up. You know those ones that are like this. We're like that, man. We're unstoppable. Often when things are at their worst, that's when we come up with truly grand visions for the future. Remember, there's always potential in a crisis. Let's take this opportunity to make new choices, to see things in a different way, because we can refuse to repeat the past. We can refuse to accept that that's just the way it is. We can look towards a different future, but only if we act now. So ask yourself, what South Africa do I want to be living in 10 years' time? A country that just stumbles along like that drunk guy trying to walk home from the shebeen? A country collapsing under its own weight like a sumo wrestler? Or how about a country walking tall, head held high, together? Pick your scenario, then chart your path. And with that, it's time to wrap up this 2020 edition of Giraffe Neck News. Remember, to build a socially cohesive South Africa, we all have to stick our necks out a little. We need to look over the trees and make decisions for the long term. So choose wisely every day, because each choice we make defines the future, good, bad, or in between. And that's it. We're done. I'm Tumi Marake, and from everyone here, stay safe and stay strong. We'll meet up again in a year's time to compare notes. Deal? Done. See you on the other side. Goodbye.